Consider the following story provided by Chad and Lanita Newswander. When Stephen J. Field took up his appointment as municipal magistrate in Marysville, California during the 1850s gold rush, he was facing the relative lawlessness of a frontier town. Not only could the town not afford a jail, it was virtually impossible to transport the prisoners to San Francisco. To make matters worse, the judge who had been sent to help Field establish peace on the gold fields, Judge William Turner, frequently threatened Field's life. Although he had come from a much more civilised life in New England, Field realised that if he didn't adapt, then he would be dead, and the peaceful administration of justice in Marysville would come to an end. So, Stephen Field decided to buy a pair of revolvers, learned to fire them from his pockets, and then stalked Turner. He noted, "I acted on my plan. I often met him in the streets and in the saloons, and whenever I drew near him, I dropped my hand into my pocket and cocked my pistols to be ready for any emergency." Stephen Field survived and was able to provide justice for the people of Marysville. While some might say that he should have taken a more reasonable and conciliatory approach, Field knew that Turner would simply see this as weakness and continue to bully him. It was this capacity for shrewd judgment and willingness to act that led to Field being appointed to the highest court of the land, the US Supreme Court, from 1863 to 1897. You may wonder what this story has to do with being political in an organisation. However, if I had begun by using the ancient Greek term metis, the point may have been lost. Before outlining what metis is, let me first distinguish it from another term, Machiavellianism. Both terms, metis and Machiavellianism, involve a capacity that might be considered to border on being sly and cunning. Niccolò Machiavelli was a statesman in 16th century Florence. He wrote a book called The Prince to guide Lorenzo de' Medici, the ruler of Florence, to maintain power. What shocked people then, as now, was the raw pragmatism of his advice. Two quotes will serve to show the ruthless practicality of his advice. "If an injury has to be done to a man, it should be so severe that his vengeance need not be feared. Never attempt to win by force what can be won by deception." A definition of the modern Machiavellian administrator is one who employs aggressive, manipulative, exploiting and devious moves in order to achieve personal and organisational objectives. These moves are undertaken according to the perceived feasibility of achieving an end, but they show little or no concern for the feelings, needs and rights of others. In other words, it means doing whatever is necessary without moral restraint under the circumstances to achieve an end. It is worthwhile noting that Machiavellian leadership produces, at best, no better performance and, at worst, lower performance. So it stands to reason that Machiavellianism should not be a feature of good leaders. The major negative impacts are organisational cynicism and emotional burnout. Although Machiavellianism usually operates from the top, it can also be deployed by those seeking to undermine leaders. A former police commissioner in Australia, in an interview with me, told me of the attempts used to undermine him as he tried to modernise the force and get rid of rogue cops. He said, "In policing, there are a lot of good people, a lot of fantastic people. But there's a really, really hard subculture. It's almost the dominant culture in policing in this state. It's not held by the majority of people, but it's very, very powerful. and it's anti-authoritarian. It doesn't matter who the Chief Commissioner is. If you were the Chief Commissioner of the day and you did something they didn't like, they would work against you and they would work against it. And some of them are very, very good at doing that. They use the media because they have natural relationships with the media from a work sense. But they also use them just to pump misinformation out, to destabilise, to undermine, to white-hand, to resist. And then that gets caught in the culture because, of course, there's some people that see that's the way you play the game in order to climb the corporate ladder. It's not about doing the job, doing it well and doing it ethically. It's about superficially doing that. But in the background, working to remove rivals. It's classic backstabbing behaviour. Thus, Machiavellianism can operate from the top and from the middle echelons. Now let us turn to the notion of metis. The concept comes from Greek philosophy. Metis means living by one's wits, by negotiating with those in power and navigating through administrative processes when trying to achieve an outcome. It is well established in ancient Greek history and was understood as cunning intelligence. It was brought into play in large sectors of their Greek social and spiritual life and valued highly within their religious system, according to Datian and Vernont. Metis does not imply being sly and devious. Rather, it means the use of practical intelligence in order to know which laws to apply to a given situation, how much of a particular rule than another, and when to forego the rules in favour of shifting to other goals. It is most appropriate in fluid situations where variables and the environment are constantly changing. In this way, metis is able to deal with the unexpected and with those situations where the attempt to simply apply rules or procedures does not bring about an effective outcome. People working in international development face complex challenges where there is no clear solution or easy answer, and very often a deep difference in cultural values. Frequently, such workers are faced with ethical challenges. After some time, it may be difficult to retain a sense of one's own personal values when having to be expedient as well as to achieve important goals. A typical example from the development context is when a development worker has been engaged to manage a development project. Often, the parameters and targets of the program have already been set before the development worker arrives on site. He or she is expected to follow the log frame and report on progress towards the targets. However, once the development worker arrives, it becomes clear to them that the log frame and targets don't really align closely with the community's real needs. The problem is that funding is tied to meeting these targets. In this situation, a development worker might engage the concept of metis to assist them to both meet the requirements of the funding donors and also meet the needs of the community. What separates the wise person's application of metis from the clever opportunist, the sly Machiavellian, or the outright criminal is that a wise person uses metis to bring about a greater good and is directed by noble virtues. A wise person is therefore able to be timely, anticipates potential problems, and ultimately contribute to the social good. Invariably, metis depends not just on cunning, which is not a bad attribute, but on experience and the perception to know how things really happen rather than how they are supposed to happen. When I was interviewing senior officials in a very well-run state government department, I frequently encountered stories of metis at work. A very experienced officer told the head of her government department, "Well, as long as you know what the rules are, you can break them because you know what you're doing. It's when people break the rules and they've got no concept of what they've done and why they've done it that it's a problem." I'm one for seeing what all those rules are, but there's always a way that you can get around that by getting a premier to approve early drafting. And so as long as you know what the rule is and you follow that, then you can justify it. In other words, what she was saying was not to break the rules, but to know how to bend the rules or to time your plays. However, at all times, the desired end is not malicious or self-serving, but to achieve a worthwhile goal. In this instance, her intention was to enable some good legislation to be passed for the public good. Might I suggest that a good way to consider this dilemma is the philosophical notion of dialectics that has its Western origins in ancient Greece, but was developed by the 19th century philosopher Hegel. It is also evident in the ancient Chinese Tao Te Ching. Essentially, dialectics means the evolution of change through the playing out of opposite tendencies. This leads to a paradox that stability and coherence occurs when the opposites are acknowledged and negotiated rather than excluding or ignoring them. In other words, consider the ultimate desired change that you are empowered to bring about. Acknowledge and anticipate that opposition will occur. Then consider how the desired outcome can be achieved through skillful actions that remain consistent with your own personal values. To sum up, a leader can use power to achieve positive ends by knowing the official and unofficial rules of the game. They don't break the rules technically, but devise alternative routes or find other relevant rules. For example, in human resources, there are many rules that can lead to potentially time-consuming negotiation and arbitration processes. A successful leader tries to achieve a just end without necessarily jumping straight into the legalistic route, which is far less flexible. A powerful leader anticipates situations, sounds out possibilities, and caucuses effectively before meetings by identifying potential allies and opponents, and preparing responses to likely challenges. It is not easy when working in a deeply different culture to keep one's own cultural calibrations. This is especially so when you have been tasked to complete a project that you know cannot or should not be implemented as prescribed. Perhaps we can conclude with a statement by Machiavelli that is equally true for those leaders displaying metis. He who wishes to be obeyed must know how to command.